Come join us each week as we dive into topics about the joys and the struggles of motherhood. By no means are we experts. We're practically flying by the seat of our pants, or should I say, mom jeans. On this podcast, you will find a judgment-free zone where we discuss not only the best parts of being a mom, but the not-so-glamorous parts too. You can expect unfiltered, real mom talk, humor, grace, and a sense of sisterhood. What makes our podcast unique is that we understand there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to being a mother. We're not going to pretend that we know everything too, because we definitely don't. We just want a place to share our stories with you. Thank you so much for tuning in to Mom Jeans, trying to fit into motherhood.
Welcome to Mom Jeans, the podcast. We are ecstatic. I was going to use the word excited, but ecstatic is the word I'm going to use because we have our first guest, and it's Bridget O'Brien, who is a pelvic floor therapist, and we have infinite questions for her, so we'll see if we can get through it all in an hour, but we're going to tackle the pelvic floor today. So goal of this episode is to talk about the importance of the pelvic floor for women's health overall, but we'll just specifically dive in on guidance for pregnancy and recovery for different types of births as well, as all of us have had our own journeys. So that's our goal for the day. So welcome, Bridget, and let's dive in with a little bit of what happened in your week. So we like here, Bridget, to start with a little high-low, what happened this week with you and your family. So Danielle, do you want to start us off this week?
Sure. I don't have anything too exciting, but my high is I actually finished a book today. So a lot of times when I have time to read a book, it's like, oh, but I could be cleaning, I could be doing this. So I actually made it an effort to sit down and finish a book, and it was awesome. It was oh my gosh, what was it called? The Housemaid. And I just found out it's a trilogy, so now I have 2 more books to read. My low, if I'm thinking right off the bat, yesterday, just because with the weather changing and it's being like hot and then cold here in Montana, just allergies going through that. So Weston's got a little sniffly nose, and then my throat and like eyes were itching really bad yesterday. So I missed my workout. But other than that, things are going good over here.
Good. Bridget?
Man, this is a great question. I would say my high is that I'm postpartum this time around, getting back to running. So I did like a successful walk jog, which is a big deal for me, which we'll get into a little bit more. But running postpartum was one of my big goals. So doing that successfully outside in Ohio, which is great in April.
Yeah.
So that was great. And then I'd say low, I am navigating sibling jealousy between a baby and a toddler, which is hard.
Yeah.
Like very hard. So I would say that's the low, but I feel like it's a growing experience, right? But in the moment, it's like, it's hard.
Totally.
But we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Yeah. I was just sitting with Sierra. We did music class this afternoon and looking at her, thinking about like,
fun.
I get to give this undivided attention to her, but in like 17 weeks, we're going to have another being here to take some of that attention. It's going to be hard to navigate. I think that's a whole episode is sibling jealousy. So we'll have you back for that.
I was going to say, I'll certainly be listening. It's hard. And I feel like every family's so different with it and every kid is different. So, oh my gosh, it's like the best thing and the worst thing, but
totally.
We'll get there.
Nice. Well, my high of the week is I texted our Mom Jeans chat, and I just was having like just one of those really I was proud to be a mom moments this weekend. Like Sierra was sleeping well. She was feeling good. She was walking now, and she's just in a giggly, fun mood. She's eating a lot, and she's about to be 14 months. And I just was having, it's like someone said a comment to me. They're like, it's amazing how like a normal weekend can feel like such a gift. And like, that's exactly what this weekend was. It was just, we were in town. Everybody was happy and healthy, and like that normalcy just felt wonderful. So that was my high of the week. My low is we've moved a little bit since then. Her mouth is killing her. She has 7 molars, maybe not 7 molars, but 7 teeth coming in. So her whole mouth is just like a hot mess right now, and I just feel for her. She's cranky and angsty, and it's just been a tricky thing to navigate. So I don't know if anyone else has teething recommendations besides a little bit of Tylenol and teethers, but she's struggling.
Poor thing.
I know. Yeah.
That's got to be the worst feeling.
Yeah.
I know, 7 at a time, like
Makes me so sad.
Yeah. She's got like 2 canines, 4 molars, and then like another one on her bottom. I'm like, oh boy.
oh
But
man.
on one hand, I'm like, would I rather them all come in at once and then have like a week of pain or, constant ongoing? So we'll figure it out.
Oh, you should definitely mention that what she said, one of her new words she learned this week.
Oh my gosh. I forgot about
Yes.
this. I had one of my most proud mom moments to date. I taught her how to say Target.
It's so cute.
That's amazing.
It's very cute. Actually, let's see if I can play the audio for the pod here.
That's incredible.
Because it's pretty cute.
It is.
Okay, you ready? Let's see if you can hear this.
Target? Target. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That is so cute. Oh
It's
my
very
God.
It was very cute. She was the last
That's the best face.
crew to walk, but I think she was just working on a few words in the interim. So that's been fun. So Leah, what happened in your world this week? What was a high and what was a low?
I don't even know. Great question. I've been so swamped at work that I don't know of anything else going on, to be completely honest. We haven't used the snot sucker in like 8 days, so that's been a huge win. Hopefully the babies are all staying healthy finally. Oh, you know what? Going out to breakfast was a lot of fun this past weekend. We adventured out, Michelle, Cece, myself, and Wesson, and went to a great breakfast spot downtown, and that was a great time. Yeah, if that, I don't have much to report this week.
That counts. That does remind me, after breakfast, I think, Leah, I told you this, but I went to Goodwill and I found one of those electric cars that I never had as a kid, but always wanted, for $19 and like 50 cents, 49 cents, something like that. And I was like, this is too good to be true. I plugged it in. It didn't work, but it was so cool. And it was like, had black exterior, like leather seats. But then my husband got new batteries for it and it works great. So we have a fully functional electric car for a 13-month-old who can't drive it. But one day, I hope she appreciates my Goodwill find.
Like one of those little like ride-on cars.
Yes.
I'm still salty at my parents to this day because I never got one of those, and all of my friends had one. And I got to my dad, like he knows that I'm still bitter that I never got one as a kid.
Oh man, I had a Barbie convertible.
I just had this conversation because my son from my mother or my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, they got him an actual like ride-on dump truck. It has like a Bluetooth thing on it, so he's like jamming and driving down the street, and he has like one of our neighborhood kids in the back of it, and he's like lifting the thing up and she's falling out of it. And I was like, I never had one of these things, and I'm actually jealous of my 3-year-old son.
All right. Shall we dive into, while we're all here, the pelvic floor?
Let's do it.
And so much more, right? It's just the connection of it all. All right. So Bridget, I'd love for you to let's just get to know you a little bit. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, your family, and just how you got into the world of pelvic floor PT?
Yeah, so I am originally from Columbus. I grew up playing soccer. I actually went to Duquesne University in Pittsburgh for my undergrad and my doctorate, and I met my husband there. We're both PTs, and I played soccer there. And like I feel like a lot of athletes go into athletic training or PT. So I went into PT thinking like sports, this is what I'm going to do. And when I was out in Tucson, I worked at a sports clinic, and my mentors were awesome. And then moved back here after 5 years to be closer to my family. And then I got pregnant and my entire world changed, to be honest. I had a really tough first pregnancy, both like physically, mentally, emotionally. I had no idea what was normal. I kind of did what everybody does and it's like, oh, well, what doctor did you use? And just kind of went on recommendations from everybody. And long story short, I ended up being a pelvic health patient and I had a really rough birth. I had a really bad perineal tear, and I ended up also having a colorectal procedure at 37 weeks. And then postpartum, I had no idea what hit me. It was like a train hit me. And I remember going vividly to my 4-week appointment and saying, like, oh my gosh, like, what do I do? Like, how do I get back to running? Like, I was a marathon runner, sports were my life. And I got a very odd response of, like, well, moms don't really run, like, just walk. And I
What?
remember being like, wait, what? What do you mean? I was shocked, like shell shocked. And I remember also being like really embarrassing, right? Nobody wants to ask these questions, being like, when is it like safe to like go back to like having sex with my husband? And she was like, oh, girl, with what you went through, give it like at least a year. Like maybe don't even think about having kids again. Just make sure you have a lot of wine. Like it was the worst
Oh my
experience in
gosh.
healthcare. And I remember and I remember coming home and calling my husband. I was in the car and I remember being like, if I'm going through this as somebody who's a doctorate level professional, like
Yeah.
what the heck else is everybody else going through?
Right.
So long story short, it like lit a fire under me for women's health and was like, that is just horrible. And I ended up emailing my boss and said, like, hey, as soon as I get back from maternity leave, I want to take pelvic health PTs. I want to specialize. Like, there's no looking back. So I was a patient first for a really long time. I kind of rehabbed myself, to be honest. And I have done it ever since full time, and I love it. I couldn't ever see myself doing anything else. But my favorite part of it is the patients. And unfortunately, I hear stories like myself a lot. And there's so much to be done, and women are so strong, and I absolutely love it. So that's where I'm at so far.
That's awesome. I just got goosebumps when you were like,
Yeah.
there's no looking back. Like it's just these like making
Yeah.
moments in your life that really do take you a certain direction.
Yeah. Yeah. It certainly was kind of like in a way, like feel like I'm supposed to do this. And there are some days that are really hard in women's health, and there are other days that are incredible. And it just, at the end of the day, I feel like there's so many people to help, and people are so gracious. And that's all you can ask for as a healthcare professional.
Totally. Wait, I feel like we could do a whole episode just on your birth story itself, because you heard ours for a long
Yeah.
time, and the postpartum appointment that you had, and like what you were told, because it's crazy. But to your point, like you're a PhD level, doctorate PT, and being able to like hear these things, and it's just like, what is everybody else going through? That was a really good way to say it.
Yeah, it was crazy. And I remember just feeling so many things at once and also not being able to feel anything. And just like my immediate reaction was like, oh my God, like this can't be real, right? Like people don't actually go through this. And then the more people I talk to and the more patients who come in and they're like, well, I was just told it was normal.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Right.
No. It would be common, but that doesn't mean it's normal.
Yeah.
It's my favorite conversation to have. That's why I'm like, please talk to me about the pelvic floor all the time.
I like that. Yeah. What do you think? I want to go into like generally what's the pelvic floor, but I guess as you think about your own recovery, what were the things in your birth or pregnancy that you think had the most impact on your own recovery?
Great question. I would say, so I had 2 completely different births and I prepared for them completely opposite. And I intentionally did everything I didn't do the first time. But I would say in general, what I learned about the pelvic floor was that it has way more to do with your nervous system and your brain and your breathing and your diaphragm. And you really control it through your breath and your mind. You don't control it with necessarily like squats and being super strong. So I would say the first time around, I was so determined to have a quote unquote like fit pregnancy and continue to work out as hard as I could and just be the person I thought that I was going to be forever. And I wasn't really open to taking like a different pathway, right? So I did like the very traditional, like you go to your OB, you do what you're told, you think that like the healthcare system is just going to like take care of you, boom. And what I really have learned is that you need to do your homework and you have to be confident in yourself and you should know your preferences, and you really have to, at least this is what I learned both personally and professionally, is like you have to know yourself. And even if you do know yourself, it can still like things can happen, but there certainly is no amount of Kegels that's going to prepare you for birth, and there's no amount of anything that's really going to prepare you other than you got to trust yourself and know your preferences and really trust your healthcare team.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start with just more before we dive in any further. Like, let's take a break. What is the pelvic floor, and why is it important for overall health? And I guess I would maybe a dumb question off that. Do men also have a pelvic floor, or is this just a women's thing?
They do. They do. The muscles are named different things, but they do have a pelvic floor. There is a whole sector of pelvic health PT dedicated to male PT. I'm a women's health specialist, but I work with a couple of PTs who treat a lot of male. So they do a lot of like prostatectomy, prostatitis, cancer, that type of thing. But they can have a lot of the same issues. Presents differently, but great question. So the pelvic floor, it sits like a hammock, right? Like if we're talking like pubic bone, like bikini area, tailbone in the back, and then your two hips on the side, your pelvic floor sits like a hammock, right? So it's the supporting structure for all of your bowel function, bladder function, sexual function, organ support, right? So, and pain, right? So any of those functions it's responsible for. So it keeps things in or it lets things out. There's a whole bunch of nerves that run through it as well. And I mean, if you think about it, if things are not going right in that department, you either have bowel, bladder, sexual health, or organ issues. So it's a pretty big muscle group. There's actually 16 muscles that it's made up of. I think a lot of people think it's just like one squeeze muscle, but it's actually a group of 16. And your hip muscles actually hook into your pelvic floor. They're kind of like cousins. So, if you think about like a lot of either like athletes or people who have had like hip injuries or hip replacements, even a lot of the time their pelvic floor is affected and you have to do two types of rehab. So it's really, really important in my opinion. I think we should all know about it.
That's awesome. Yeah, it was one of those things. Like I'd never really known about the pelvic floor until it presented itself in two times in my life. Like one was I was having a lot of back pain, and
Mm-hmm.
and we couldn't quite figure out what's going on. But then I ended up doing a lot of pelvic floor training, and that actually ended up helping my back quite a bit. So that was like a really interesting connection. And then of course, like pregnancy of all things, right? Like, and I'm still in the middle of my pelvic floor. I don't even think I'm at the middle yet. Like I'm probably like 20% through my pelvic floor, postpartum journey because I have a long, long way to go. But at the same time, it's been interesting because you don't really connect the dots with your pelvic floor until you need to. How about you, Danielle? Was that the same for you, or have you always? You're in health as well.
I didn't know much about it. I follow a fitness person who does it, like she did prenatal workouts and talked about it a lot, and that's when I kind of realized like it's a thing and like need to focus on it a little bit, but I don't know how well or how much really I knew.
Yeah. And so Bridget, what, like, when you see patients now, what are some of the most common issues that you're treating, and what are some of those symptoms that you see, and then like what do you do all day? Like what does a pelvic floor therapist do?
Yeah, so each pelvic floor therapist does different training. So myself, I all women's health. I do have special training in pregnancy postpartum, but I would say I see pelvic pain, I see urine leakage, I see bowel leakage, I see pelvic organ prolapse, I see a lot of endometriosis. So whether that's for infertility reasons or that is for chronic pelvic pain, or even like I see actually a lot of C-sections for scar-related pain or abdominal weakness, diastasis recti, kind of you name it. Like, for example, I had 10 patients today. Every single patient had a different diagnosis.
Wow.
So it's really very, yeah. So I see like my typical day, pending the day, I have one patient one-on-one. I never have two patients at a time or anything. And we're always like in a private room, and then we'll go out to the gym for stuff. And we always have like a code word, like, tell me if you're like, you like pineapple, like just say pineapple. I'm not going to ask you in the middle of the gym if you peed your pants, right?
Right.
But yeah, so we do definitely have like a private setting. And then if we need to go get somebody on a treadmill, or like, I don't know, let's say somebody's having prolapse symptoms, which we'll get into in a second with picking up their 25-pound child. Like, we're going out to the gym and we're picking up a 25-pound weight to figure out how we can change lifting, breathing, position so that you don't have symptoms and you can do that. So as far as symptoms go, or as far as like how people present, I would say that a lot of people say like, man, things just don't feel right, whether it's postpartum, chronic pelvic pain. Like, it's really hard to describe pelvic stuff. So it could be like burning, stinging. It could be like deep aching, or like, hey, I've never been able to put in a tampon type of thing. So even postpartum, I can't tell you how many times I talk to people postpartum about like, oh, my tampon fits differently, or like, man, things just don't feel right down there. And I think that that's a lot more common than we necessarily think, and we're not sure if there's anything we can do about it. So we do so much education about bladder, bowel stuff. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in a day I explain like proper bowel mechanics to people, because most people have no idea. And it's really, it can, I mean, it can really change things for a lot of other functions. So that's a big part of it, is just education. Um, and then nobody knows what the pelvic floor is, right? So I have my model. Everyone makes fun of me because I constantly have a pelvis model in my hands. But I almost brought it tonight, and I was like, no, Bridget, that's
Oh,
too
you
much.
should. No, you definitely should.
But a lot of education, pending the person, right? We're either training the pelvic floor to relax and open. Like, I do a lot of birth prep, and we go through, hey, what position are you going to be in? Like, let's say like early labor, mid labor. If you've had a birth injury before, you had a really hard time pushing, like, let's go through different pushing positions that actually put less pressure on your pelvic floor. Let's talk about different pushing positions, or let's talk about different pushing types and those types of things, like epidural considerations for post C-section. Like, we do lots of stuff. If somebody has a C-section and wants a VBAC or an HBAC or another C-section, your pelvic floor by no means is spared by a C-section. So we still do quite a bit of stuff. It's just, it really is tailored toward the patient.
Good to know. I do want to have, if we get pregnant again, have a VBAC if possible, because I did have a C-section. But yeah, interesting.
What's an HVAC?
An HBAC is home birth after cesarean, and VBAC
okay.
is vaginal birth after
Nice.
cesarean.
Nice.
You made a comment about, I guess, patients having like bladder issues. Like, I've known women who, they have teenagers now and they still have like leakage. They're like, I jumped on the trampoline and like I peed myself, and I was like, I don't know if that's normal. Like, I mean, I thought it was until I learned a little bit more about the pelvic floor. I'm like, I think there's things that you can do to help that. Like, is that normal?
Ooh, is it common or is it normal? Great question. So I tell my patients, I'm like, look, in a perfect world, normal bladder function is you do not leak, right? Like, we potty train all of our toddlers. You shouldn't have to get potty trained again, right? Like, at a very low level, we don't want to be peeing our pants. So I think it is a much more complex problem than people give it credit for. So like, again, I sound kind of silly, but like, if Kegels worked, I probably wouldn't have a job. I wouldn't have to go back to school multiple times and have this degree to tell people to do Kegels. So it's never too late to come to pelvic floor PT. I mean that with like every ounce of my soul. Like my oldest patient right now is 85 and we're getting her like walking around. And if you ask her how many years she's had leakage for, well, my great grandson is 8. Like it's, so if you think about it, like they are muscles. You can make progress. You just have to figure out why. So that's a great question. Is like, is it normal? No, it's not normal to leak. Is it wildly common? Yes. Is it a treatable problem? Yes. Great question.
I'm definitely going to go into my own like consultation here in a few minutes because,
Go for it.
let's actually go through the pregnancy journey, right? Let's talk prenatal, then labor, then postnatal, and recovery, because I think that's going to be really helpful to kind of guide it. But my last question on like general women's health as well is it's something I'm sure a lot of women are asking. Is it typically covered by insurance, right? Like, can you typically get a pelvic floor therapist covered?
Typically, yes. Typically, you can. It really, you got to look into your own benefits, but we bill it just like we would bill regular like hamstring stretches or like strengthening, right? So the billing, it is covered. I would really, really caution anybody though to make sure you're screening. And when you're calling, I would ask number one, does my physical therapist only see one person at a time? Am I going to be in a private room? Is this a pelvic health specialist? What types of diagnoses does my therapist see? Because it's so broad, right? In PT, you could have somebody who like has some training, but really I would really, really hope that anybody who would call would advocate and say, like, I want a pelvic health specialist. I want to be one-on-one. I deserve this care. I deserve this time, because we go through a lot and we deserve a lot.
Awesome. What's the best way that you found for people to research pelvic floor therapists or to find them? Is there websites or just calling around or referrals? What's your recommendation there?
Yeah, so if you guys trust your OB or your midwife or your doula, I would say that they're a really good place to start. Probably the people who are in network are going to be who you're going to be referred to by your OB or your midwife. So that's going to be like your hospital based. Um, I don't know where all of you guys live, but most cities have a really good network of cash-based PTs, and you can use your HSA, and they're awesome too. I think it really just depends. You can find a ton of them on Instagram. Most pelvic floor PTs have a pretty good presence on some type of social media or word of mouth. That's a big one.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, Bridget, super helpful overview of the general pelvic floor, how you got into it. So maybe now we can go into the pregnancy journey, right? So starting with prenatal, what are, as you talk to moms that are pregnant with their first and second and third birth, like as sitting here at 23, almost 24 weeks pregnant, I'm very curious, like, what can moms do before birth to make things more smooth? And should I be having a pelvic floor therapist right now? What are other things that prenatal that you recommend to help women prepare for labor?
Yeah, great question. So I would say during pregnancy is a lot about you're learning the muscles, right? So most of us don't have this big education about how our bodies actually give birth. We all know we do it, right? And we know that we push at the end, but we don't know how those muscles function, what really we can do to prepare, or kind of what role any of our body actually has, or what postpartum is going to look like. So I would say it is at least worth getting 1 to 2 visits about what your pelvic floor does during birth, what you can do to prevent our third or fourth degree tear, which is actually like the tear into the muscle, which creates a lot of different issues postpartum, and how to prepare, how to maximize postpartum recovery, and then kind of tailor it towards what you need. So it really, there's some people who come in who are like, I want to know laboring positions with an epidural, without an epidural. And I have other people coming in that are like, I am so scared out of my mind to do anything and I don't know where to start. Right. So I think it's really important to know that your pelvic floor does not need to be strong to give birth. That's a talking point always. Your pelvic floor needs to be coordinated and learn how to relax. And your body and your uterus pushes the body out, not the pelvic floor. So that's really where I start. And we really get to know like what your abdomen is doing. And then from there, like the nitty gritty of perineal massage, different positions during labor that help the baby descend, different pushing positions that put the pelvic floor more on slack rather than like really, really stretched to help protect the perineum and the muscles and kind of go from there. So that is the first chunk. And then typically later in pregnancy, when you're like 38-ish weeks, assuming that you're going to 40, we start to prep you for postpartum. We're lucky in Columbus that the hospital system I'm affiliated with has inpatient pelvic health PTs who come right into your postpartum room. And they get you through those first 6 weeks, and then you come back to me and we get going with postpartum. But I would say the goal, at least for me and my patients, and I would say most pelvic health PTs, is for you to feel supported and for you to have a village and you not to skip a beat. It's going to be hard. It's going to be unpredictable, but by no means should you ever feel like you're on an island.
I know you listen to my birth story. I think right now I'm sitting here again, basically 24 weeks pregnant, and I'm having a lot of angst around like, can I push out anything much bigger? And, my pelvic floor is in no way, shape, or form recovered from the first birth. Everyone here has heard about my my leaking woes. I had the flu 2 weeks, or a stomach bug 2 weeks ago, and coughing is bad for your pelvic floor, but throwing up is 10 times worse.
Throwing up is the worst.
Oh, it's awful. It's awful. So I'm curious, like, what types of things could someone in my position or going for that second birth, do you recommend that second time, things that I can be doing to prepare for birth?
Yeah, so I think someone like I listened to your birth story, and someone who, pushed for a really long time the first time around and had a really long labor, I think number one would be, let's figure out what state your pelvic floor is in now, right? So if we're dealing with tons and tons of weakness versus we're dealing with tension, right? You need to learn how to contract and how to relax, because if you are squeezing, right, as that baby's trying to come through, it's really hard and it can slow down labor a little bit. Now there's a lot more that goes into it, right? But I would say to protect your pelvic floor, you need to know how to relax it, how to push without putting as much pressure down on your pelvic floor. Like, for example, we call it purple pushing, that is the like, okay, it's time to go, and you're like bearing down, holding your breath. That puts so much more pressure on your pelvic floor than learning to breathe with your pelvic floor and use your abdomen to get your pelvic floor out of the way and use your breath to release your pelvic floor. So I would say, with a history like yourself, energy conservation is going to be huge, and figuring out, hey, even if I have an epidural, right, what positions can I get into and how can I use gravity to make sure that I am getting that baby down as much as I can.
I had a question similar to Michelle's. So, like with my birth story, I do feel like I went into the hospital too soon, but I was having back labor so bad that like I also have back problems, like spasms. And so like we went and, I didn't want to, but I got induced because they're like, you're going to be here Monday, might as well get induced now. And so I think that's kind of like, I just don't think my son was ready. But when I was 10 centimeters dilated and they're like, we're going to push soon, they're like, he's -1. So he hasn't even dropped through, I guess, the pelvic or pelvis, I guess. And so I just wonder, is there something that I could have done or like could have helped with that, I guess?
Yeah, so I think knowledge is power, right? So it's hard to say like, could you have done anything else? It's interesting. So I don't know if you guys have heard, there's a term called the cascade of intervention. And basically, the earlier you go into the hospital, the more intervention you have, the more likely you're going to have more intervention, right? So I would say, one, that I don't think any first time mom really knows when to go to the hospital or what that point is, but I would say that number one, just kind of knowing knowing what you don't know is huge, right? So can you do anything different? I would say that you could, right? So there, when we talk about specifically pelvic floor PT, right, or we should be at least like experts in the pelvis. So I should have brought my pelvis model. We, I like keep using my hands. And anyway, so there are certain
I have a good
positions
visual
that,
with the hammock, though.
thank you, thank you. There are certain positions that open the top of the pelvis. So if you're at like -1, right, you're going to go into different positions to open up the top of the pelvis versus if you're getting to 0, we're teaching you how to do different positions with your hips, and it's more side to side type of thing. And then we're kind of moving you through those positions as far as like your labor prep appointment. So, you know, like, hey, if labor is stalled, right, for whatever reason, or the baby's not dropped, how can I learn to move my body? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a complex question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And then one of the things that you mentioned was like strength of your pelvic floor. And that was the learning I had, right? It's measured on a scale of like 0 to 5 or 1 to 5 typically. Is that right?
It's 0 to 5, technically, yes.
Yeah, now that I say that, I'm pretty sure I started at a 0, but I graduated at a 3 from my
Hey.
therapist. So I'm hoping to get to a 5 again. And that's something you measure probably for all women, not just women who are postpartum, etc.,
Yes.
because that's something that can be tracked with any issue.
Correct. Yes. And I think for like the pregnancy part of it, I think it's really important to note that you should, like, your PT can do internal, but they absolutely do not have to. Like, in at least my state, it is best practice to make sure you're talking to the OB or the midwife and getting like an all clear from a medical perspective to do anything internal. But pelvic floor PT doesn't have to be internal. I have lots of patients for many, many, many different reasons who are not okay with that. And we find a way around it. So I think that's a big barrier for some people are like, ugh, I don't want to go and get like an OB exam every single time. So we can grade pelvic floor PT that way, but we certainly don't have to.
Oh, interesting. So let's move into, like, you've talked a lot about techniques in labor and different positions, etc. So love to learn about, like, now as you've had 2 of your own births and now as you think about guiding women into labor, into the room, I'm curious, one, should we have a pelvic floor therapist in all delivery rooms? Because it already seems like your techniques are super helpful and interesting depending on positions, etc. Another question is, like, a lot of us had doulas, some of us didn't. I'm curious also around your recommendations around doulas and if you work, how you work with those as well. And then epidurals, lots of questions we can take it. So I'll let you start wherever you want.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I would love a pelvic floor PT to be in every room. I know that Um, there's like a little bit of a turf war is the way that I've had it described to me is like in healthcare just right now is so siloed where you have like your nurses and it's just too many cooks in the kitchen, and OBs are very protective of their patients and some midwives are too. And so I would say yes, I would love that. Caveat to that, I want them to all have great training in pregnancy postpartum. So not every pelvic floor PT goes into specialized into that. So I would say if you have like OB, like obstetrically trained PTs, absolutely yes, I would love that. Your second question, I think it was about doulas. I love doulas. I think they're phenomenal. I chose not to have a doula my second time around because I worked with midwives and I absolutely adored them. I think that in the way that I think OBs are phenomenal, right? So they are trained surgically, they are going to save your life. They are not necessarily your conservative care experts. So that's what you kind of get from like midwives and doulas is those like non quote unquote medical things. So you get more of like the nervous system training, the breathing techniques, all of those things that are technically not considered like medical, if that makes sense.
I often describe, like, my team has been the OB and the doulas, and it's like the OB is the science and the doula is the art
Yes.
in some ways, and my mental
Yes,
health expert
totally.
in some capacity. So that's been a good way for me to find balance in this process and, help translate these like scientific answers that freak me out into, other terms from the doula side.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
just like a personal note. I went the complete opposite route. Like the second time around, for lots of different reasons, I was not a candidate for any type of anesthesia second time around, and a C-section would have been wildly dangerous for me. So I went really deep into the midwife route, and it was completely different for me. And I learned a lot about myself and about how much more, for at least me being a medical professional, the medical stuff was not it for me. The non-medical stuff is what got me through it. So I think it's just a testament to birth is so much more holistic than just science.
I really like the way you described that, Michelle, that the OB is the science and the doula was the art. I think that was a really good way to put that.
Me too.
And not everyone need probably a majority of births these days don't have doulas. So I don't want to give the impression that like you have to have one, etc. But I definitely think it's worth every pregnant woman the opportunity to explore it, right? And just see if it's the right fit for you. Also test the personalities, because I'm sure doulas are made great and some are not trained well. So you really need to do your research on finding the right pair. But as I've said on this podcast, my doulas were like, the first to know I was pregnant, the second time I was like, what are you doing on late August? Please save the date. So it's been good.
I have another question because we were talking about positions. And so, like, in the movies, you only see, like, women pushing on their back. But I did find out that there's other birthing positions. And what, in your opinion, is one of the best?
Side lying is definitely a great one. Surprisingly, when we look at, like, if we're talking like straight pelvic floor anatomy, straight, like the perineum is like the area between your vagina and your anus. So like that's the area that tears, and I would say normal, like 80 to 90% of women have a tear the first time around. Only like 5 to 10% have that third or fourth degree. So when we talk about like tearing in this sense, I'm talking like that third and fourth degree, like muscle tear. But when we look at the straight anatomy of everything, pushing on your back with your knees apart puts the most pressure on the perineum and the pelvic floor. So in my opinion, as a pelvic floor PT, being on your side, this is getting super nerdy and anatomic, but the bottom of your pelvis, like where the baby comes out, one, if you're on your side, your tailbone's not going to get in the way. And number two, you can put your knees closer together and your feet further apart, which is going to open the bottom of your pelvis. And you're going to get like 10% more space, and you don't have gravity coming straight down on your pelvic floor. So I think side lying is great. They're doing a lot more research into side lying pushing. That, or if you can get into all fours, that's great. I tell a lot of my patients, like, we have so much research about this stuff, but at the end of the day, birth is so primal, and you're going to know what you feel good in. So I think the important thing is that you trust yourself and you know that you have options. You're not stuck.
Yeah. It's interesting. I like have always, like, especially in pregnancy or during Sierra's first pregnancy, I just loved sitting in like a wide squat position and just like hanging out. Like it felt so good. And I was like, that would be a position that I could see myself giving birth in. And, granted, in 7 hours or 6 hours of pushing, I was in every position out there. So I'm glad they helped me move around.
Yeah.
But when I was doing my purple pushing, I was just straight up in all fours. And my doula helped advocate that we switch positions. I remember hearing this like turf war a little bit between actually my OB and the doula around like, let's try a new position. And I ended up giving birth in like more of like a throne position was one of the ones that, or at least got her moving. So it wasn't a full squat, but I think I was more upright. I think I'm describing it, or what my blurry memory is telling me. So, but I don't think I did much side lying, and I'm curious to add that to my my repertoire this birth.
Yeah, it's really surprising, and that's something too that if you go to PT while you're pregnant, those are things that, assuming your PT's trained in that you can really learn what you feel comfortable in, and you can practice like different types of pushing. I mean, obviously we're not pushing, right? But you can say like, man, I really like, I cannot take a deep breath in this position. So like, if you can't take that deep breath, your pelvic floor is not really going to relax super well. So maybe you want to try a different one, but you don't know until you get into those positions. And it's always better to at least attempt before you get into a really high pressure situation, because muscle memory matters.
When did pelvic floor therapy become a thing? And do you know about how many pelvic floor therapists there are in the United States? And what's the specialized training that you guys go through for that?
Great questions. So it actually started a while, like it's been around for at least 50 years, 40, 50 years. A lot of it, so in general, the training is like you go to PT school, you come out with your doctorate, it's called a DPT, and then they do not teach the pelvic floor other than like, hey, it exists in PT school. So you come out with a doctorate in the body, but you really don't get much. They're like, hey, if you want to specialize, do it after. So a lot of PTs come out of school as generalists, and then you can choose to specialize in PT. So there are different, or in pelvic floor PT. So there's a series of different classes, and then you have to go to 2 or 3 day like lab practical, where you go through vaginal exams, rectal exams, and you have to like pass tests and that type of thing. So it's pretty extensive. I joke with my patients all the time, and I'm like, man, you really have to want to be a pelvic floor PT, because the day you go in for your practical is like 40 people you've never met, and they're all like, all right, everybody get in pairs of like 3 to 4, because you're all doing vaginal exams all day, and it's the same thing with rectal exams. So it is a lot. And then as far as, I think your other question was how many of us there are.
Mm-hmm.
Man, my short answer is not enough. The average wait time to get to a pelvic floor PT is at least 3 months, versus orthopedic PT, you can normally get in within 48 hours, if that sets the scene at all. So if you know anybody who's in PT school, tell them to be a pelvic floor PT.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
Well, and then Michelle, when you were searching for a pelvic floor therapist, you know, we live in a small town. What was that like? Were you able to find one easily?
I was recommended one from our doulas. So it was fairly easy to get connected to her, and I was able to get in right away. She was in network, which was good. So I luckily didn't have that experience of having that long wait. But to your point, I actually started seeing her with my during pregnancy. So I got established early, which was helpful. And then she helped with my back pain too. She did some dry needling to like help with that and kind of loosen things. So that was a huge game changer in my pregnancy and back pain. And then I started up with her postpartum as well. So, and then my last question during labor, and then we can go to recovery, because I think that'll take up a chunk of time. We've talked a little bit about epidural considerations. I'd love to learn a little bit more about your thoughts there.
Yeah. So, do you have any specific questions? This is such a broad topic.
It is a broad topic. Well, as you heard, I had some complications with my first one. And if you hadn't listened to the podcast, net of it is, you know, went natural for a long time, but eventually like an epidural became, it was just so much pain through the contractions that I ended up getting an epidural that got me some sleep in, which was really nice. And then the complications really came afterwards when I had spinal headaches and had to get a blood patch for that. So, you know, I guess it's a kind of a personal driven question around here is, you know, thinking about my next approach and knowing, you know, what happened the first time. When you think about an epidural, like, is there any guidance that you give people either going through their first or second pregnancy as they're asking that question? I know, Leah, you and I had this question quite a bit early on, and, you know, Danielle, I'm sure you did too, because you hear all this chatter. Sometimes for people, it's a no-brainer. Some people really want to try to go fully without any interventions or drugs. And just what are some of the things you guide patients on as they're thinking about to epidural or to not epidural?
I would say that you have to, if you are thinking about doing a natural birth, I mean, I think all births are natural, like C-section, whatever, like a baby's coming out of you. But if we're talking like absolutely zero interventions, I think your preparation looks very different. So I think if you are going that way, I tell my patients, and like, it's one thing to say, like, I want to try this, but if you're not going to mentally prepare for it, then I would caution you to definitely be open to an epidural, right? Because it's so mental and there's so much different preparation you should do to be successful. And the last thing anybody wants is for a mom to feel like they failed, right? Or they couldn't do it. I think there's a lot of rhetoric around like, oh, I wasn't strong enough, I needed an epidural. So I tell all my patients, like, there is no failing in birth. Like, safe mom, safe baby. However, if you are going to go down one pathway, you need to do the preparation and you need to learn how to deal with pain. Now, other way around, if we're talking about, oh, I know I'm going to get an epidural, I tell my patients, you want to wait as long as possible, but if you're going to be in a hospital, ask them how long it's taking to get one. Because if you are like at that point, if you're at like 7 or 8 centimeters, you're like, man, I need an epidural, there's a 45-minute wait to get an anesthesiologist or a CRNA in that room, you're probably pushing without an epidural. So timing is big, number one, and just knowing your hospital system and having that support person to say like, hey, she's going to want an epidural in, I don't know, at 8 centimeters, whatever it may be. Just having the communication is huge. And then we do go through laboring positions, epidural versus not. And then we definitely, if you are going to get an epidural, I never make a patient do anything like internal, right? But I will say like, hey, it can be helpful for you to know what cues you use in your mind and in your abdomen to get your pelvic floor to relax. Because if you can't feel it, you want to be able to feel something else, right? So you want to know, okay, if I think, for example, like I'm going to think about on my inhale of flowers blooming and it's going to continue blooming on my exhale, and I'm going to feel my abdomen stay really hard. And if I can confirm for you, hey, your pelvic floor is actually fully relaxing, then boom, you have that motor pattern down before you can't feel it in labor. Does that make sense?
I think you explained that really, really well, and I appreciate that. My question to follow up to that is, you said do the mental work. And so, like, I took a hypnobirthing class. What are the things that you recommend mentally to prepare yourself if you do want to go down that natural birth
Great question.
plan, or the sans intervention?
Yeah. Hypnobirthing, I think, is great. I think also there's a lot of great books out there. I think a lot of people get put down like down that like really like hyper natural route and don't do any type of consideration that like if you're in a hospital, it's a medical setting, right? So knowing the things that you can control in the room, having a ton of faith in your team, and then getting your mind around the fact that pain is good, which sounds so crazy, right? But like, you have to be looking forward to that pain. You have to be able to welcome it and know that it's also going to go away. And a lot of my patients, actually, I did not do this, but a lot of my patients will come to me like, what do you know about the 2-minute drills? So I had to actually look into this myself. I was like, what is a 2-minute drill? And it sounded like a TikTok challenge at first. I was like, what is this? So a lot of people will do, like if you squeeze ice for a really, really long time, right? You have to make sure everything else in your body does not care about that ice for 2 minutes until it's completely melted. So being able to get your mind in a different place and kind of retrain those pain receptors. So I guess that's kind of physical work too. But I think affirmations are great. I think you just need to figure out yourself. So how you go about doing that, I have lots of patients who actually go to mental health providers and figure out kind of what makes them completely relax, or if they have any fear going into birth at all, they get that taken care of from a mental health perspective. So I think above all else, maternal mental health from pregnancy all the way through, oh my God, probably the rest of your life is the most prepared you can possibly be.
Man, I wish I knew you before I gave birth.
Seriously.
Man, let me tell you, this is a long time coming, and I wish, that's why I tell all my patients, I'm like, all I want is to be the person that I wish I had, because everybody deserves it.
Yes, I love that. You mentioned books to read. Is there one that stands out to you?
Yeah, there's actually my best friend, her daughter's a year old today, but she was really, really preparing for a natural birth, and she was recommended this book. It's called, I think it's called Natural Birth and Hospital. It's a blue and yellow cover. I forget the exact name of it, but she said, she was like, I think you should read this. And so I did, and it actually like takes you through literally trying to have a natural, unmedicated birth in a hospital, the considerations that you should have with how do you talk to a healthcare provider who is medicine, 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 and how do you meet that appropriately without it being confrontational. And it takes you through like how to actually create not necessarily a birth plan, but birth preferences, and in a very, in my opinion, realistic way. I love it. I recommend it to lots of patients.
Yeah, I think it's called Natural Hospital Birth. That's what you said, but that's the best of both worlds is the title of it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's great.
So let's transition to like the last part of kind of the topics here, which is postpartum. So, everyone has their own journey, pregnancy, labor, and now in postpartum, I'm sure the paths even spread even wider. So I'd love to understand, you talked a little bit about today, you saw 10 patients, everyone had 10 diagnoses, but for women postpartum, I guess my first question is like, how early should someone come to see their pelvic floor therapist? And maybe you could go through like the top 3 things that you've seen and common ways to treat it. I know I talked a lot about C-section pain and scars and recovery, diastasis recti, obviously labor and prolapse, etc. So, kind of let you take that where you want as well. So I guess first question is, how soon should someone come see you? And then what are some of the major paths people take postpartum?
Yeah, generally, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks is where I see within like my hospital system, where I see patients. I will occasionally see patients really early if they have a ton of pain, if they have an epidural related injury, something that is just outside of the pelvis, or a really severe injury. Like I had somebody who had, for example, a really scary nerve injury and had almost no bladder control. And they said, like, you need to be at PT within 5 days. So it really can be, assuming that you are in a system where providers work together, it can be as soon as you need to. But I would say most patients I try to see around that 6 week, and I will schedule them out before they give birth. I'll say, like, when's your due date? We're going 6 weeks and we're going weekly for X amount of weeks just to be in there. So I would say probably around 6 weeks. So typically we want to make sure that you're the 6 week magic clearance, with quotations around it, you are cleared by your doctor. And then you come see us. So as far as diagnoses that are common, I would say, urine leakage is a big one. Pain with intercourse is number 2, and that is C-section or vaginal birth, both. And third would be either, this is probably a tie, but I would say constipation and or like that prolapse pelvic heaviness type of feeling. And typically people have no idea what that means. So it'd be like, it like feels like there's a tampon stuck all the time, or like I jump and I feel like something's going to fall out of me. So that, I would say, all of those.
Now, are all of those common with postpartum?
Oh yeah. That's just postpartum diagnoses. Like that's just the other ones get out into like crazy other things. But as far as postpartum, that type of cluster, if you will. And it's typically more than one of those things. They come for one and they're like, oh, well, I also have this other thing. Or like, how long should it hurt for? That type of thing. So it starts as like, oh, I pee when I sneeze. And then we get into like, how's your sex life? It's horrible. How are your poops? Well, they're also horrible. So it kind of does roll from one to the other. And I joke with my patients. I'm like, I kind of feel like most of my patients postpartum are like, I am like your medical best friend who you have all these weird questions about and you have nobody to talk to. And you're like, oof, does this happen to you? 99% of the time it's happened to somebody else, but we don't have that safe space to talk
Yeah.
about. But it's typically more than one thing.
So you're the person everyone gets real comfortable with.
Oh, 100%. The first thing I tell people is like, there is zero TMI. I made sure when this clinic was built that this room was soundproofed. So like, we're going to get into it. The more you can tell me, the better.
Yes.
And there is zero judgment because I promise you I've heard it before. And if I haven't heard it before, somebody else out there pelvic floor wise has. So you are surely not the first person.
And I love your line, like what's common versus what's normal.
Yes.
Like those are a really good framing for, I mean, I'm thinking that in all phrases in my life right now. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a TMI question.
Yes.
I know everyone's probably wondering too, regardless of your birth, any recommendations for your first poop or first
Oh my God,
few
so
after
many.
birth?
So many. This is like my favorite question, mainly because like there are certain times in my like own postpartum journey that I'm like, oh my God, what was so terrifying? Pooping was the
Yes.
worst. Oh my
The
God.
worst.
So I would say number one, take the stool softener. If they offer it to you,
Yes.
take the stool softener. I give all of my friends a bottle of stool softeners for their shower, and I say, you're going to thank me later. Stay on it. There is no shame. Number one. Number two, squatty potties exist for a reason. Everyone thinks they're like a joke, but they actually do like relax the muscles in the back of your pelvic floor. So they do help you. So number two would be a squatty potty. And number three is we say belly big, belly hard. So when you inhale, your pelvic floor relaxes. So you should feel it in your belly. Belly gets big, pelvic floor opens, belly hard. Keep your belly hard and breathe through it. At no point should it mimic pooping out a baby. We're not doing that postpartum. I love this question. It's great. I hope that's helpful for someone.
Oh, 100%.
That was fantastic. Big fan of the Squatty Potty over here, just going to say.
Collace was my best friend.
Yeah. I will say too, this is getting into like really the nitty gritty, but there are also like specific techniques for people who have like a lot of vaginal stitches or C-sections. This is the same thing, is wherever you have those stitches, like if they're vaginal, right? TMI, but if they're vaginal, like put some toilet paper on your hand and like light pressure on those stitches is going to actually help to protect that area. Same thing with like coughing, sneezing, pooping, whatever it may be with your C-section, like gentle pressure over your scar with like a pillow can help so much with pain for the first few weeks.
So I had a C-section and they gave me essentially a corset to wear.
Oh, a belly binder.
A belly binder, yes. Are you pro or con? For or against with those?
Yeah, so I am pro if it was fit by somebody for you and it helps you with pain, especially for a C-section. It's not a have to, but it certainly can be helpful. Unless you have a really severe diastasis, I'm talking like you can put your whole fist through your abdomen type of diastasis. I am not pro them for vaginal births. Reason being is because we have this thing in the clinic, I call it the prolapse chicken, because if you like squeeze the middle of the chicken, like the bottom comes out. So it's very visual. But if you do that, right, if you squeeze too hard, right, you're going to put a lot of pressure down on your pelvic floor, and we do not want that postpartum. So I'm not very much pro them for for vaginal birth, but for C-section, they can be really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, I wore mine a lot.
Waist trainers are a hard no for everybody. Yeah, waist trainers, hard no. That's a question I get all the time. Should I be wearing a waist trainer? No, period.
And, outside of a pelvic floor, like appointments, like, is there just general postpartum recovery tips you have for each of those phases, like pre 6 weeks and post 6 weeks? And then, of course, longer term, but I guess thinking more through like that fourth trimester of your first 3 months.
Yeah, totally. So I have so many, but I would say the biggie that I get is like, when can I return to like the gym versus like when can I run or when can I get back to HIIT workouts. So any type of plyometric, which would be like running, jumping, HIIT workout type of thing, there's a lot of evidence that says minimum of 12 to 16 weeks. That fourth trimester, really running, if you are trying to avoid long-term complications like prolapse, leakage, you name it, you really should be giving yourself that time to rest. A lot of my C-section moms will say like, well, I didn't push anything out, and respectfully, no. However, you did grow the thing and you did have a bowling ball on your pelvic floor for a very long time, and those tissues are still healing. So there's still a lot of, and it's not like a guarantee that if you go back before 12 weeks that you are going to go back symptom free or that you're really going to hurt yourself. But as far as evidence-based recommendations, there's a lot of evidence to support that we should be waiting. So that's probably the number one question that I get asked. And then honestly, this is such a PT answer, but it really depends for the rest of it. It depends how the end of your pregnancy was, or it depends on, like, for example, like, did I push for 6 hours? Or for myself, like, you have a muscle tear in the place that's holding your organs together. So, like, we're probably not going to be working out for a while, but there's other things you can do. So it really is patient dependent.
I did have a question. So I guess what's the major difference that you see between, I guess, vaginal birth and C-section? Because I guess I'm actually more surprised that you do see a lot of C-section patients. I guess I just assumed, like you said, I didn't push a baby out. So like,
Yeah, we tend to see a lot more pelvic tension with C-section. So the things that we see would be bladder urgency, like you feel like you have to pee a lot, or feel like you have to pee constantly and you can't hold it necessarily. Or frequency, like you're peeing like twice an hour, even though you feel like you shouldn't. Pain with intercourse is a big one, and then scar pain. So where that scar is, right? It's not like they're like trying to rip apart your muscles. They really do try to spare as much as they can, but there is more damage to those muscles because of the incision. So if you're not taking care of your scar, or if you are going back to things too quickly and not rehabbing those muscles, you're at a higher risk to develop just kind of poor scar tissue mobility, and that can like kind of mess with your bladder in a way. So we see a lot more pelvic floor like muscle guarding or tension, and that's really related to scar pain and really related to that muscle that is affected by the C-section. Long story short, that muscle contracts with your pelvic floor. So the muscle is called your transverse abdominis, the one that they kind of separate, that is hardwired to contract with your pelvic floor. So if you're damaging that muscle, your pelvic floor tries really, really hard to kick in and help. And then that creates a lot of the symptoms like pain with intercourse and that type of thing, along with like breastfeeding is always a big question mark with pain with intercourse. So that's also something to consider.
So you brought up something that I'm actually dealing with. A couple weeks ago, I mentioned this on the podcast that I had to go get an ultrasound done on my scar because I've been having really recently, as in like the last 2 months, moments of excruciating pain around my scar. And the ultrasound didn't yield anything other than some inflamed scar tissue. So glad it wasn't anything worse than that. But would you have any recommendations for somebody in my situation? Because postpartum, I did so much scar massage and like really tried to prevent getting to where I'm at today. So any recommendations for someone like me?
Yes, my first recommendation would be, do you have a pelvic floor PT?
I do not.
Yeah, so again, I would definitely get looked at by someone who looks at movement, because on like an ultrasound and a lot of medical testing, they're snapshots in time, right? They're not looking at how your abdomen is moving and twisting and whatnot. So a lot of times scar pain is related to movement and related to the different layers of muscle, different layers of visceral tissue and visceral structures that you have. So I would get somebody on your team who looks at how you're moving and see if they can reproduce that type of pain with any movement pattern or testing, and then go from there, especially if your red flags have been ruled out by the doctor. That's really unfortunate, though. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that advice. I actually had not considered a pelvic floor
Yeah.
therapist, and I will probably have to look into that.
Yeah, just make sure that they see a lot of pregnancy and postpartum type of stuff.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd love to wrap with just one congratulating you on your first walk and jog, WOG,
Thanks.
if we want to call it.
Vlog. I love that.
And WOG, yes. And maybe you could just kind of close with like, what's your pelvic floor journey been to get where you are today?
Oh my gosh, it's been so long. It is ongoing, to be completely honest. But in general, so I had a really odd emergent colorectal procedure at 37 weeks because of where my lovely big-headed baby sunk into. So I had that, and then I ended up, long story short, oh man, this is like a podcast in itself, but I ended up throwing up every 30 minutes of my 12-hour labor, and then pushed for 2 hours and then sustained a really bad tear. So I ended up developing a really, really quick pelvic organ prolapse postpartum, and then had a scar tissue problem. So I had weakness on top of tension, on top of bowel issues because of the colorectal thing. So I became like a very complex pelvic patient. And actually, the first time I went to pelvic floor therapy did not go well. I was told to do Kegels and was like, ugh, that doesn't make any sense. So I ended up kind of rehabbing myself, and it's been a whole bunch of learning. And I'm really grateful that I have the education that I have. And this time around, like I said, I ended up having a really, really short labor, and I had a really short pushing time second time around. It was literally 2 hours start to finish from my first contraction to him being here. So it was fast and furious. And I am now rehabbing for the second time, and it's still hard, but it's much less symptomatic, and I'm getting my way through it with a whole bunch of PT stuff, a lot of relaxation and a lot of strengthening of everything else.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations.
Yeah,
I'm
thanks.
sure getting out there, getting to someone who's such an athlete before, like running for the first time is huge. Like for me,
Yeah.
it was getting to play volleyball again. It was such a rewarding experience, and you know how much hard work you have and probably have to go, but it's the sense of normalcy again, which is so reassuring.
Definitely. My personal goal this time around was to be able to carry my toddler with no symptoms whatsoever, and he is 40 pounds. And I did it, and I was like, this is better
Wow.
than running. Great.
Wow.
It's mom
huge.
strength.
That's huge.
Yes. That's awesome.
Thanks.
And then if people want to get in touch with you, or if they have more questions, do you have any favorite resources, favorite podcasts you listen to, or Instagram accounts you follow, or websites? What's the best way for people to get more information about their pelvic floor or
Yeah,
reach out to you?
so I am like a completely open book. Like I said, I love to talk about this stuff. I think we should all have stuff like this to talk about all the time. There's if for anybody who's pregnant, there's something called the evidence-based birthing podcast that's really good. I don't know if you've heard of that before. It's like the EBB.
No.
No, that's a good one. So it's interesting. There's so many episodes, but I love that one. And then as far as Instagram goes, there are pregnancy, postpartum. I don't know if you guys know who Dr. May Hughes is. She is a really good one. She does a lot of exercise type of stuff. Oh my gosh, there's so many. She's a really good one, and if you look at like who she follows, she's great. But she's a pelvic floor PT who has just a lot of good resources, and she has a blog, and it's all very evidence-based. So she's really good.
Okay, we'll link those both in our show notes as well. So, and I'm like gonna start listening to those as well. So, closing question, we're gonna ask all of our guests, what's your favorite parenting advice you've been given or you like to give?
This is so corny, but when I was just listening to your guys' podcast, the fourth trimester, and I think it was the fourth, or whichever one it was, when someone said, parent like the best boss you've ever had. And I think that is so incredible, because I remember being a new grad PT, and I had literally the best boss who let me make mistakes and learn, and was just like always in my back pocket to help me when I needed it. And I feel like that is probably the best thing I've ever heard. So thanks, guys.
Lisa gets all the credit for that one. It's so profound. I think about
It
it as
is.
well.
It's great. That and take a lot of showers as much as you can.
That's what I had mentioned on a recent one, was like, put the baby down and take a shower. Like,
Yeah.
just
Totally.
because nobody told me to do that, and I went a really long time without showering. But I was just gonna throw this out there. You said you're an open book, and you have me so intrigued about your birth story now that if
Yeah.
you ever want to come back and tell us about your birth story, I think we would all be
Yeah.
interested to hear it.
Sure. I'm, like I said, I'm super open. Yeah. Oh my God. Wild. Yeah.
Wild.
I haven't written them down yet, but I think I should so I don't ever forget them, but I don't think I will. But yes, anytime you guys want to chat.
No one's going to want to give birth after listening to our podcast and all of our
Oh my gosh. I was talking to my patient the other day, and she was like, you need to stop terrifying people. And I was like, I'm not terrifying people, because I had a phenomenal second, like couldn't have gone better.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
most of the time things go awry. So like you got to know both sides of it.
Totally. And I just heard 2 fantastically smooth first births as well. So like
Yeah.
all the stories are out there. So let's have you on to tell your story. And we'll also have someone tell their story of like, I had a textbook birth. I went into the hospital and I had a child and it all was
beautiful.
great. So
yeah,
it was beautiful.
Yeah, I met someone like that the other day, and they were just like, yeah, I think just it's all a mindset. I'm like, okay, I'll keep that in the back of my mind for next
Ugh.
time.
I would have had a hard time not reacting to that
It's like-
comment.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she pushed for 30 minutes.
Oh my
I'm
gosh.
like, that's amazing. I was happy for her, but yeah, I was like, my brain wasn't working. Like, I couldn't get in the right mindset. But yeah, like you said, Bridget, it's all like you got to be mentally prepared, I feel like, and I was not.
Yeah, it's hard, man.
I felt like I was, and mine still went totally awry. So I felt like I spent a lot of time getting mentally prepared, and I had like all of my practices in place, and
Yeah.
we still ended up where we did. So
Yeah. I think for me, it was interesting. I was just talking to my husband about this, and I was like, why do you think the second time went like so smoothly? And he was like, I think for you, it was, you didn't have a choice. Like the doctor told you, like it was like really high risk for you. So like you knew it, you didn't have a choice. And he said to me, he was like, it was interesting watching you the second time around because my midwives were so different. He was like, and they did minimal things. And he was like, for you, for some reason, you having people just kind of ignore it was the best thing that ever happened to you. So it was so interesting to hear that from a different perspective, because I would have never thought that. I don't know. Birth is wild. We know nothing about it.
Birth is wild.
We know nothing.
well, it just makes me think, like, going back to, okay, you can't just think that now in recent years women have started to tear during birth. Like it has to be historically since the beginning of time. So like what was I think primally, and I think caveman days, like what was the recovery? Is this like, it's just, we know so much more now, but
Yeah.
human anatomy hasn't changed significantly over time. And so like, what did they do?
I get this question all the time, surprisingly. We talk about this in therapy all the time. And I finally like did a deep dive on research myself, and like my husband, he's a PT as well, but he is like a mini pelvic health PT, because I'm always like, Peter, why is this stuff happening? Like, why now? Like, why are we so full of so much intervention? And so anyways, long story short, I did a bunch of research on this, and I actually asked a bunch of other PTs that I know too. And the intervention rate, like the number of interventions specifically in the US, which is wild, is so far above the rest of the world. Like we intervene more, we have more 3rd and 4th degree tears, we have more C-sections, and there's arguments that it's our healthcare system. There's arguments that it's the culture in which we are raised. There's even like theories out there that if you look at like the rates of mental health issues and anxiety and depression, you're going to see a very similar curve. So I think it's acknowledged in the medical community that there is a huge rise in these things, and I think we're trying to figure out why. So I think it's a very valid question, and the fact that you're even thinking, I think that's about all my patients. I'm like, man, women are so smart and moms are so smart to even be thinking about these things so globally.
On that note, with the cave women are amazing, and they have been since the beginning of time. Bridget, on behalf of all of us, we're so thankful that you came to join us today. I learned so much, and you're just got so much knowledge and depth, and you have, as Leah kind of mentioned earlier, you have such a beautiful way of telling the story and feeling heard as moms, as women, and I think you're absolutely achieving the goal you've set to say, I want to be the PT I never had and the one I wish I had, because it is just outstanding, and I think a role model for all pelvic floor therapists out there. So if anyone out there is considering it, go for it, because we do need more, and I just really appreciate your time.
Let's do it. Moms are warriors, man. Also, you guys are doing a phenomenal job at like saying these things out loud. Like I said, I'm a fan. I listen. I feel like I know you guys already.
Well, thank you so much for listening. That's awesome. We love that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great name, by the way. I don't know who came up with it, but 10 out of 10.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Bridget. And let Michelle know if you are interested in coming back on and talking about your birth stories, because that is something that we want to pursue, as well as like gathering birth stories from other people, just because it's so complex and no two births look the same. And I think we can all learn something from each other. And so, yeah, this was awesome. I loved your explanation of everything. I learned so much, and love to have you back.
And that wraps up another episode of Mom Jeans, trying to fit into motherhood. Thank you again so much for listening to us. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars so other mothers out there like you can find us and listen. If you would like, you could follow us on any of our socials at Mom Jeans, the podcast. If you have questions, would like to send us your birth story, or give us suggestions or things that you would like to hear, please email us at hello@momjeansthepodcast.com. See you next week.